My parents publicly excluded my kids as too chaotic, so I quietly returned every gift. They wanted a perfect evening without the noise of my children, so I gave them the quiet they asked for by taking back every single thing I had ever given them. Hey everyone, before we get in the video, don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button if you want more stories just like this. Thanks for the support. My name is Julia, and I am 34 years old. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, tucked inside a thick, cream-colored envelope with gold calligraphy that shimmered under the foyer lights. It was heavier than it looked, the paper expensive enough to make a sound like a rustling leaf when I slid my thumb under the seal. It was an invitation to my parents' 35th wedding anniversary, a black-tie gala planned for a local venue that was known more for its exclusivity than its warmth. I stood there in the hallway of my own home, balancing a basket of laundry on one hip, staring at the names embossed on the front. It was addressed solely to me and my husband, Ben. There was no "and family" scrawled beneath our names. No mention of the two small, energetic children who currently occupied the living room, building a fortress out of sofa cushions. At first, I thought it was a mistake. My parents were difficult, certainly obsessed with appearances and the curated image of their lives, but they were grandparents. They prided themselves on hosting events where every detail was micromanaged to perfection, from the orchid centerpieces to the specific vintage of wine served with the entree. Surely, they hadn't intended to exclude their only grandchildren from such a milestone celebration. I set the laundry down and called my mother, expecting her to laugh off the oversight, to promise that a separate invitation for the kids had been lost in the mail. But when she picked up, her voice was clipped and efficient, the same tone she used when speaking to a contractor who had missed a deadline. She told me that the decision was deliberate. The venue was not child-friendly, she explained, using the term as a weapon to describe a sterile room filled with expensive glass and sharp-edged furniture. She went further, though, crossing a line that shifted the ground beneath my feet. She told me that my children, 5-year-old Sam and 3-year-old Lily, were simply too chaotic. They were loud, unpredictable, and messy, she said, and she refused to have her special evening disrupted by tantrums or spilled juice. She wanted a night of sophistication. She insisted, a night where she could show off her family without worrying about a pair of unruly toddlers ruining the aesthetic. I stood in my kitchen, the phone pressed to my ear, listening to the silence that followed her declaration. It wasn't just that they were uninvited. It was the way she spoke about them, as if they were defects in the otherwise perfect machine of her life. She didn't ask if we could get a babysitter. She told us that under no circumstances were they to appear. I felt a cold wash of anger rise in my chest, but I swallowed it down. I knew that arguing, pleading, or raising my voice would only give her the satisfaction of labeling me as dramatic. I had spent years trying to win her approval, trying to prove that I was a good enough mother and that my children were worthy of her love. But in that moment, something inside me just switched off. I didn't fight back. I didn't cry. I simply told her that I understood, that Ben and I would be there, and that we would respect her wishes for a sophisticated, quiet evening. I hung up the phone, looked at the invitation one last time, and then walked into the living room to watch my chaotic children laugh. The decision didn't come to me all at once. It settled in like a slow tide rising against a levee. Over the next few days, as Ben and I discussed the logistics of the evening, who would watch the kids, what we would wear, how long we would subject ourselves to the atmosphere judgment, I began to think about the nature of my relationship with my parents. It had always been transactional. I provided the milestones, and they provided the criticism. I provided the photo opportunities, and they provided the unsolicited advice on how to improve them. But perhaps the most tangible evidence of our dynamic was physical. For years, I had poured my resources into buying them affection. Every birthday, Christmas, Father's Day, and Mother's Day, I had scoured the internet and high-end boutiques for the perfect gift. I thought that if I gave them enough nice things, they would eventually see me as an adult who deserved respect. I started to mentally catalog the items I had purchased over the last decade. There was the espresso machine that sat in their kitchen, a top-of-the-line Italian model that cost me nearly $1,000, bought because my mother mentioned once that she liked lattes. There was the sound system in their den, a sleek surround sound setup I installed for my father's birthday, so he could watch classic films in immersive quality. Their dining room hutch was filled with Waterford crystal that I had selected piece by piece to replace their old, chipped glassware. Even the throw pillows on their sofa, the ones that were meticulously arranged and never looked mussed, were from a boutique home goods store I had discovered during a business trip. I realized that I had furnished their life. I had paid for the comfort they sat in, the coffee they drank in the mornings, and the music that filled their home. And now, having declared my children too chaotic for their presence, they expected to continue enjoying the luxury I provided while treating the source of that luxury, my family, as an inconvenience. The realization was galling. I wasn't just angry about the party. I was angry about the years of imbalance. I looked around my own home, modest by comparison, but filled with the noise and life they so despised, and I felt a surge of resolve. If they wanted to exclude my children, they could exclude the trappings of my children's mother as well. If they wanted sophistication and silence, I would give it to them in its most absolute form. I didn't tell Ben about the full extent of my plan at first. I just told him that I wouldn't be bringing a gift to the party. I told him that my presence was the gift, a lie that felt hollow on my tongue, but necessary to keep him from worrying. He was angry about the exclusion too, threatening to boycott the event entirely, but I convinced him that we needed to go. We needed to show up, smiling and composed, to show them that their petty insult hadn't broken us. But I had a different kind of breaking in mind. I wasn't going to break my own heart by begging for inclusion. I was going to break the cycle of their entitlement. I spent the next 2 evenings preparing, not a speech or a confrontation, but a logistical operation. I waited until my parents were out of the house, likely attending some planning committee meeting or a spa appointment, to put the first phase of my plan into motion. The key to their house had been on my keyring since I moved out after college, a symbol of trust that they had never bothered to revoke, mostly because they liked the idea that I could come by and water their plants when they traveled. On the Thursday before the Saturday party, I drove over to their house in the early afternoon. The neighborhood was quiet, manicured lawns stretching out under the midday sun, the silence so heavy it felt oppressive. I parked my car in the driveway and unlocked the front door, stepping into the cool, air-conditioned stillness of their foyer. It smelled of lemon polish and artificial potpourri, a scent that always reminded me of a museum rather than a home. I walked through the rooms with a practiced eye, identifying every single item I had purchased over the years. This wasn't about stealing. I wasn't taking family heirlooms or items that belonged to my father's parents. I was taking back what was bought with my money, items that were technically mine until I gifted them. But a gift, I realized, requires a relationship to sustain it. If the relationship was a facade, the gift was nullified. I started in the kitchen. The Italian espresso machine was unplugged and carefully boxed. The expensive knife set, the one I had imported from Japan, was wiped down and secured in a protective case. I moved to the living room and began stripping the shelves. The crystal glasses were wrapped in towels and packed in a bins I had brought from home. The silk accent pillows, the luxury throw blanket, the expensive abstract art prints I had bought for their anniversary 5 years ago. It all came down. The house began to look skeletal. Where there had been color and texture, there were now empty spaces and dust outlines. It felt like an archaeological dig, reversing the layers of my contribution to their life. I worked quickly and efficiently, fueled by a cold determination. There was no malice in my movements, no urge to smash or destroy. This was a restoration. I was restoring the balance. I filled the trunk of my SUV in the back seat, the car sagging slightly under the weight of the repossessed generosity. When I was finished, I stood in the center of the living room and looked around. The room was bare, save for the furniture that came with the house when they bought it 20 years ago. It looked stark, uninviting, and distinctly lacking in the sophistication my mother craved. It looked like the hollow shell of a life that prioritized things over people. I locked the door and returned the key to the hide-a-rock by the porch steps, ensuring they wouldn't know I had been there until they walked through the door. I drove away with a car full of expensive belongings, feeling lighter than I had in years. I didn't keep the items. I didn't want them in my house, serving as reminders of this toxicity. I drove straight to a high-end consignment shop that dealt in luxury goods and then to a donation center for the rest. I liquidated thousands of dollars worth of gifts for pennies on the dollar, taking the cash receipt and the tax deduction slips and shoving them into my pocket. The money didn't matter. The point was the empty space. Saturday evening arrived with the sky bruised, purple and gray, a storm threatening to break over the venue. Ben and I dressed in our finest. I wore a navy blue gown that I had bought years ago for a work event, simple and elegant. Ben looked handsome in a tuxedo, his jaw set in a way that told me he was still holding back his own irritation. We dropped the kids off at my sister-in-law's house, where Sam and Lily were already halfway through a game of hide-and-seek, oblivious to the slight their grandparents had dealt them. Seeing them so happy, so full of life, only hardened my resolve. My parents called this chaos. I called it joy. If they couldn't see the difference, they didn't deserve the privilege of seeing it at all. We arrived at the venue. A grand ballroom with chandeliers the size of small cars and a floor so polished it reflected the ceiling. The room was buzzing with the hum of 200 people sipping champagne and exchanging air kisses. My parents were standing near the entrance, receiving guests. They looked like royalty, or at least the suburban version of it. My mother was wearing a gown of shimmering silver, her diamonds catching the light, and my father was in a tuxedo that looked tailored to within an inch of its life. They were beaming, soaking in the admiration of their friends, the perfect couple celebrating 35 years of marriage. When they saw us, their smiles faltered for a fraction of a second before snapping back into place. My mother kissed my cheek, her perfume overpowering, and whispered that she was so glad Ben and I could make it alone. She made a point of looking around us, as if checking for stray children, and then sighed with theatrical relief that the coast was clear. Ben stiffened beside me, but I took his hand and squeezed it gently, a silent signal to stay the course. We didn't argue. We didn't make a scene. We simply nodded and handed them the card I had prepared. It was a simple, white envelope containing nothing but a printed note that read, "Congratulations on your special evening. In the spirit of exclusivity and removing unwanted noise, I have adjusted my contributions to your life accordingly. Enjoy the peace and quiet." I watched my father's eyes scan the note. His brow furrowed, confusion knitting his eyebrows together. He looked up at me, his mouth opening to ask a question, but the press of the queue behind us pushed him forward. We were swept into the room, away from the receiving line. We spent the next hour circulating, drinking weak cocktails, and making small talk with people I barely knew. My parents watched me from across the room periodically, their expressions shifting from confusion to suspicion. They could sense that something was off, that I was too calm, too detached. Usually, I would be hovering, trying to help, trying to be the dutiful daughter. Tonight, I was an observer. I watched them toast to their marriage. I watched them cut their cake, and I felt nothing but the cool satisfaction of the secret I was keeping. The party began to wind down around 11 o'clock. The band played a slower set, and the older guests started to drift toward the exits. Ben and I stayed until the very end, a strategic choice on my part. I wanted to be there when the bubble burst. As the last guest departed and the venue staff began to extinguish the candles, my parents approached us. My mother looked tired, her smile fading into the pinched look she usually wore in private. She asked if we were ready to go, mentioning that they had asked their driver to bring the car around. They assumed we would all go back to their house for an after-party drink, a tradition they usually enforced, but one I had no intention of participating in tonight. I told them that we couldn't stay. I told them we had to relieve the babysitter, a lie, but a convenient one. Ben and I walked them to the curb, watched them get into their town car, and then waved as they pulled away into the night. As soon as their taillights disappeared around the corner, Ben looked at me, his face a mixture of anxiety and curiosity. He asked me what I had put in the card. He asked me why I had been so calm. I didn't tell him the specifics then. I just told him to drive. We followed the town car at a distance, staying several blocks back, navigating the quiet streets until we saw it turn into their driveway. We parked down the street and waited in the dark, the engine idling softly. It took about 10 minutes for the porch light to flick on. We watched the silhouette of my father open the front door. We watched him step inside. And then, from our vantage point down the block, we saw the lights flip on in the front hallway. They moved through the house like a pair of ghosts, switching on the living room lights, then the kitchen. I imagined the moment of realization. I pictured them walking into the living room, expecting to sink into their leather armchairs and pour brandy, only to find the room stripped bare. I imagined my mother reaching for the crystal to pour a celebratory drink and finding nothing but empty wood. We didn't need to hear the screams to know what was happening. The body language was enough. My mother flung her hands up to her head, pacing frantically in front of the large bay window. My father stood in the center of the room, turning in a slow circle, gesturing at the walls. They looked like actors in a silent film, their movements exaggerated by the panic of the unseen. It wasn't just that the things were gone. It was the violation of their sanctuary. Their home, their stage, had been dismantled. The chaos they feared hadn't come in the form of a loud child. It had come in the form of a void. They were left with the silence they had so desperately coveted, surrounded only by the echo of their own entitlement. The phone call started before we even made it back to our own house. Ben's cell phone buzzed first, lighting up the dashboard of the car with my father's name. He looked at me, his thumb hovering over the screen. I shook my head. I told him not to answer. Not yet. Let them sit with it. Let them wonder. We drove in silence, the hum of the road filling the space between us. When we pulled into our driveway, the calls had escalated to my phone as well. Text messages were popping up, rapid fire, strings of capital letters and exclamation points demanding an explanation. Where is everything? Have you lost your mind? This is a sick joke, Julia. We went inside and locked the door. The house was quiet, save for the ticking of the clock in the hallway. We didn't discuss what we had done. We just went about the routine of getting ready for bed. I washed my face, watching the water swirl down the drain, feeling cleaner than I had in weeks. The confrontation was inevitable, but I had control over when it happened. I wasn't going to engage in a shouting match at midnight. I wanted them to be tired, to be sober, to be sitting in their empty living room when they heard my voice. The next morning, I woke up to a notification that I had been blocked from the family group chat, a petty move that made me laugh out loud. But by 9 a.m., my father was ringing the doorbell. I opened the door, finding him standing on the porch, looking disheveled and older than he had the night before. His eyes were rimmed with red, and he wasn't wearing his usual facade of control. He pushed past me into the entryway, demanding to know why I had robbed them. I told him to sit down. I told Ben to take the kids to the park so we could talk. Once we were alone, I didn't yell. I spoke calmly, precisely. I explained that every item I had taken was something I had purchased. I told him that since they had decided my children were unwanted guests in their lives, I assumed the tokens of my daughterly affection were equally unwanted. I told him that I had simply returned my investment, cashing out my equity in their happiness. He sat there, sputtering, trying to find the logic to refute me, but he couldn't. He couldn't argue that the gifts weren't mine, and he couldn't argue that he hadn't insulted my children. He tried to threaten me with legal action, with disownment, with never speaking to me again. I nodded at each threat, accepting them as gifts. I told him that if disownment meant my children wouldn't be subjected to their judgment, then I would accept it gladly. I told him that the silence he wanted was now a permanent fixture in his house. The conversation ended when he realized I wasn't going to apologize, and I wasn't going to give anything back. He left the house with his head down, defeated by the realization that his power over me had evaporated the moment I stopped caring about his approval. In the weeks that followed, the silence in my own life was profound, but it was the silence of peace, not emptiness. My parents did attempt to rally the family against me. They told everyone I had stolen from them, that I was unstable, that I was vindictive. But to my surprise, the narrative didn't stick. Perhaps because I had the receipts, literally and figuratively. Perhaps because my aunts and uncles had witnessed for years how my parents treated my children. The support I expected to lose never materialized. Instead, I gained a strange new respect. People began to see the cracks in my parents' polished veneer, and they didn't like what they saw. I didn't replace the gifts. I didn't buy them anything for the holidays that followed. I sent a card with a generic greeting and nothing else. They stopped inviting us to things, which was exactly what I wanted. My children were spared the awkwardness of grandparents who looked at them with disdain. Instead, we surrounded ourselves with friends who loved the chaos, who celebrated the noise, who didn't mind spills on the rug or loud laughter in the hallway. One afternoon, about 6 months after the party, I ran into my mother at the grocery store. She looked smaller, somehow less imposing than before. We stood in the produce aisle, staring at a display of apples. She didn't demand an apology, and she didn't sneer. She just looked at me, her eyes searching my face for the daughter she used to control. She asked about the kids. I told her they were wonderful, loud and messy as ever. She gave a small, tight nod. She didn't say she was sorry, and I knew she probably never would. Her pride was too thick, her image too brittle to survive a genuine apology. But as she walked away, pushing her cart, I saw her hesitate, looking back at me one last time. I realized then that she was living in the quiet she had asked for. She had her sophisticated home, her exclusive parties, her crystal, and her silver. Well, the ones that were left. She had everything she wanted, stripped of the messy, chaotic love that had been holding it all together. I walked out of the store into the bright sunshine, got into my car, and drove home to my noisy, chaotic, perfect family. The silence I had returned to them was a mirror reflecting their own choices back at them. I had taken back the gifts, but in doing so, I had given myself something far more valuable. I had taken back my peace. And as I pulled into the driveway and saw my son running across the grass, screaming with joy at a butterfly, I knew I had won. I didn't need their approval anymore. I didn't need to buy their love. I had everything I needed right there in the beautiful, chaotic noise of my own life.